They say war has rules, but I've never known one that didn't break them when the sky turned red. It was late in the Pacific in '44, if memory serves me right, when Japan learned the hard way that mercy doesn't always survive the smoke. We were tired, bone-tired of the Long Island crawl. You could smell the rust and salt and diesel everywhere, a taste that got into your teeth and never left. The Japanese had convoys running between their home islands and the territories still under their control, hauling whatever they could to keep their war machine breathing. Rice, ammo, men, it didn't matter. If it floated, it was a target. The Navy had been hunting those convoys for months, and by then, the Americans had it down to an art. Radar, code breakers, spotters, all of it worked together like a living thing. We'd learned their routes, their timing, even how they zigged when they should have zagged. When the message came down that another large convoy had been spotted north of Luzon, no one needed a pep talk. Every man on every ship knew what that meant. It was payback for Pearl, for the boys who never made it off Bastogne, for every name still carved into the waves. The convoy was big. Dozens of transports, escorts, oilers, and cargo ships, a floating city crawling through hostile water. They thought they were safe under the protection of destroyers and patrol craft. They thought wrong. The submarines got there first, silent hunters in the dark. The airmen would come later, but the first blows came from below. I remember hearing the reports over the radio, the clipped voices of men who'd just fired torpedoes and were waiting for the count. 1 hit, 2 hits, and then the static when the explosions rolled through the water. Ships don't scream when they die, but men do. By dawn, the surface was a graveyard. Black plumes of smoke twisted upward like giant fingers clawing at the sky. The sea was littered with oil, debris, and survivors clinging to whatever would float. You'd think that would be the end of it. You'd think once the ships were gone, the killing would stop. But war doesn't have an off switch, and that morning, the killing had only just begun. The sun rose over a slick, glistening ocean, a mix of oil and blood, and it looked like molten glass from the air. I wasn't in a fighter. I was serving on a support vessel stationed a few hundred miles south, but the radio chatter came in hot that day. Reconnaissance reported numerous enemy survivors still alive in the water, trying to form clusters around floating debris. The plan, as it was told later, was to neutralize any potential rescue effort, cut off Japan's ability to recover survivors who might recrew future ships. It sounded clinical on paper, like a math problem. But what happened next was something no math could explain. The Hellcats came first. Big, powerful, confident. They roared in low over the wrecks, their wings flashing in the sun. From the deck, you could almost feel the vibration through the airwaves as they dove. Some of the boys up top said they could see the flashes of gunfire through binoculars, like fireflies dancing across the sea. Those pilots had seen too much. They weren't heartless, they were spent. You could tell by the way they attacked, precise. Relentless. The machine guns stitched across the water like sewing needles. Each burst walking across a field of bodies and wreckage. People talk about war being heroic. I've seen heroism, sure, but that wasn't it. That was fury. It was the kind of rage that comes after years of seeing what the enemy could do and deciding, right or wrong, that it was time to end it. I don't excuse it, but I understand it. We all do, those of us who were there. From what the records later said, more than 3,000 men had been in that convoy, sailors, soldiers, and some civilians. When the torpedoes hit, maybe half survived the initial blasts. Some made it into rafts, others just hung to wreckage. When the planes came, the ocean turned into a storm of lead. Survivors tried to wave white cloths, but from the sky it looked the same as a signal flag. You couldn't tell one from the other when you were flying 200 knots, and the world below was on fire. I remember one pilot telling me years later, he'd flown in that strike group, that the smell hit him before the sight did. the sweet, heavy reek of oil and salt mixed with something else. He said the first time he saw men in the water, he hesitated. The orders were clear, but the eyes looking up at him were just men, not enemies. He squeezed the trigger anyway. He told me he never forgot the way the bullets danced across the surface. Tiny eruptions of white foam, then red. After his first pass, he said, he didn't feel human anymore, just mechanical. And that's the truth of it. War can strip everything human right out of you until you're left with reflex and muscle memory, and the Japanese didn't expect that kind of fury from the Americans. They still believed in the old codes: honor, capture, exchange. But after Guadalcanal, after Tarawa, after every island where surrender meant a grenade under a blanket, the Americans stopped believing in mercy. The ocean became another battlefield, and anything that moved was the enemy. Word of the strafing spread fast through the fleet. Some men cheered, others went quiet. You could tell who'd been in the thick of it and who hadn't. The ones who knew what bullets did to flesh just stared out over the horizon, listening to the wind. One chief petty officer I knew sat in silence for an hour, polishing the same wrench over and over, until someone asked if he was all right. He said they had their chance when they started this war. Then he put the wrench down and walked away. By the next day, the reports said there were almost no survivors left to rescue. A few Japanese ships tried to come in under cover of night, hoping to pick up whoever was still breathing. Our planes found them before dawn. The rescue ships went down just like the rest. It was brutal, efficient, and final. Japan's convoy lifeline was bleeding out. I know how it sounds. Even saying it now, it makes my throat tight. But you have to remember what the Pacific was like back then. It wasn't about land or pride anymore. It was about survival. Every side believed the other had forfeited the right to mercy. And when you reach that point, humanity becomes optional. The ocean doesn't care about sides. It just swallows what it's given. That night, the sea was calm again, almost peaceful. The fires burned out and the smoke settled low like a fog. From the distance, it could have been mistaken for any other night in the Pacific, quiet, endless, indifferent. But for the men who flew those missions and the few who survived below, that night never really ended. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives. I met one of the pilots decades later at a reunion. He was old, thin, his hands trembling as he lifted his coffee. When I mentioned that convoy, his eyes clouded over. He said he still dreamed about the faces in the water. He said he couldn't decide if what he did was justice or madness. Then he smiled, bitter and tired, and said, "Maybe both." That's the thing about those days. You didn't always get to know which side of the line you were standing on. You just followed orders, did your job, and hoped the world would understand someday. But the world never really does. It forgets the smell, the heat, the sound of bullets hitting water. It forgets how war makes monsters out of good men and ghosts out of the innocent. The Japanese government later called the incident an atrocity. The Americans called it a victory. Both were right in their own way. 3,000 men went into the sea, and by morning the Pacific had closed over them as if they were never there. Only the oil slicks and the crows above the waves told the truth. When I look back on it now, I don't feel pride or shame. I just feel the weight of it. The way the air must have sounded, the way the pilots' hearts must have pounded as they dove again and again into that smoke-filled horizon. The way history simplifies what was never simple. People like to talk about war as though it's clean, as though the good guys always do good things. But I've been around long enough to know better. Sometimes victory comes with ghosts that never stop whispering. And if you listen close enough, you can still hear them out there, in the crash of the surf and the hum of old engines. They're not asking for judgment, just remembrance, because that's the only mercy war ever gives. Morning came soft and slow, but the Pacific has a cruel way of hiding horror beneath calm water. The sun rose as if nothing had happened, turning that oil-slicked sea to gold. But the gold was a lie. Underneath floated the bodies of men who had once believed they would see Japan again. The radio said target neutralized, mission success, and no further contact. But every man who'd heard those transmissions knew what that really meant. The ocean had taken 3,000 more, and this time, it wasn't from torpedoes, it was from us. I remember the hush that came after the reports. In a war that never seemed to stop, silence was rare, and it was never peaceful. It was the kind that made men stare at their hands, wondering what they'd become. The pilots came back to their carriers with 1,000-yard stares. They didn't swagger like victors, they shuffled. They smelled of cordite and fuel, the scent that sticks to you after you've fired so long your nerves go numb. Some couldn't eat. Some tried to laugh it off, but the laughter didn't last. One pilot, young as they came, barely 20, sat on a crate next to the hangar bay. His goggles still marked his face, white circles in the grime. I remember him saying, almost to himself, "They just kept waving, waving and waving." No one answered. You don't know what to say to something like that. You just light a cigarette and sit beside him until the silence feels like understanding. Word reached command that the Japanese were furious. They called it barbaric, inhuman. But at that point, both sides were past pretending. Tokyo had rained hell on cities full of civilians, and America had sworn there'd be no mercy until the rising sun fell for good. That's how wars rot the soul. They make vengeance feel like justice. Back home, the newspapers called it a decisive blow. Enemy convoy destroyed, they said. Stay. Japan's supply lines in shambles. It sounded clean and glorious in print, but glory fades when you've seen the aftermath through binoculars. It's one thing to sink a ship, it's another to see men clinging to the wreckage, praying to gods that won't answer. Dunsu. The men who planned those strikes didn't do it out of cruelty. They did it out of cold logic. The Pacific was a numbers game. Tonnage sunk, sorties flown, fuel burned, lives saved on future beaches. The fewer Japanese ships left to carry troops and ammo, the fewer Americans would die storming the next island. It made sense on the chalkboard, but chalk doesn't bleed. By that point in the war, Japan's merchant fleet was dying faster than it could be replaced. Every convoy that went down meant factories without parts, soldiers without food, planes without fuel. The air raids that followed would finish what the subs started. But even victory can look ugly when you see how it's earned. I've read diaries since then, from both sides. One Japanese sailor wrote about the attack. He said when his transport was hit, he managed to grab a plank of wood and float for hours. The oil burned his skin and he could hear others calling for help. Then he heard the planes. He thought they were coming to rescue him. When the first bullets hit the water, he realized the truth. He wrote that he stopped moving, hoping they'd think he was dead. They didn't. His last entry ended mid-sentence. Someone found that diary years later, sealed in a rusted tin can that washed ashore. You can't read words like that without feeling something shift inside you. The past doesn't change, but how you see it does. We were young, angry, and full of fire. The Japanese were the same. Both sides thought God was with them. But on that ocean, under that burning sky, no God showed up. Just men trying to survive. I remember standing on deck that night long after the last report came in, and the ocean was calm again, black and endless. You'd never know what had happened there if you hadn't seen it. The stars hung bright and steady, the same stars those men must have looked at as they slipped under. For a moment I thought about what it would be like to die like that. Cold, alone, the war fading above you. Then I stopped thinking. In war, you learn to turn off the parts of your mind that can't help you. We moved on to the next operation soon after. That's how it always went. You finish one fight, clean your weapon, and wait for the next. But some things followed you anyway. Every time we crossed calm water after that, you could see it in the men's faces, the quiet glances toward the horizon, the unspoken prayers. The sea remembers even when men try to forget. Years later, I met a historian who asked if I thought the strafing was justified. I told him that's the wrong question. War doesn't ask for justification. It just demands obedience. The men who flew those planes didn't wake up that morning planning to shoot survivors. They followed orders written by men who'd never been shot at, and those men followed the orders of men who wanted the war over. That's the chain. It's easy to judge when you're not at the end of it. But I'll tell you this. Every man who's ever seen that kind of killing carries it somewhere. Maybe not in the eyes or the hands, but deep down. Some drank to forget it, some prayed to make sense of it, and some, like me, just told the story because silence is worse. The Japanese learned from that convoy. Afterward, they scattered their routes, used decoys, and sailed only at night. But it didn't save them. The Pacific belonged to the Americans by then. Radar and reconnaissance saw everything. The ocean had become a trap. You could run, but you couldn't hide. That convoy was just one chapter in the slow strangling of Japan's lifelines. By the time the war ended, more than half their merchant marine was gone. Still, that particular day stood out. 3,000 men erased in less than 24 hours. No survivors to tell the tale, no wrecks worth salvaging. Just oil slicks stretching for miles, rainbowed under the sun, it became a legend whispered among sailors and pilots. A story no one wanted to claim, but everyone remembered. One of the officers I served under told me later, that was the day we stopped being men and started being weapons. He was right. You could feel it after that mission. Something in the air changed. We were no longer fighting to win. We were fighting to end it, no matter the cost. And when you reach that point, compassion becomes collateral damage. I sometimes wonder if the Japanese survivors, the few who might have lived long enough to be rescued, ever spoke of it. Did they curse our names? Did they understand? Maybe they did both. I've met former Japanese sailors since, old men like me, gray and tired. When we shake hands, there's no hate left, just shared exhaustion. We both know that ocean took more than ships. It took pieces of us, too. The Pacific looks beautiful now in the history books, sunsets, waves, victory parades. But for those who fought there, it's not blue, it's black. And every glimmer of light on the surface reminds us of something that didn't come back. I suppose the historians will keep arguing about that day, whether it was tactical necessity or moral failure. They'll use words like controversial and strategic outcome, but the men who were there don't need debates. We remember the sound, the smell, the look of it, the screams that didn't carry far enough to matter. You don't forget that. When I close my eyes, even now, I can still hear the roar of engines echoing over an empty sea, and the sharp, short bursts of gunfire fading into static. The war made ghosts of us long before it ended. And that day, somewhere between duty and damnation, we added a few thousand more to the ranks. War makes a man think he's seen it all, until something new proves him wrong. After that convoy, most of us believed we'd reached the end of what human beings could do to one another. But war wasn't done showing us just how deep its well went. The pilots called it the hard rain. I remember one saying it was like watching the ocean bleed. He said every time he pulled the trigger, he felt like he was aiming at ghosts because they didn't move right anymore. They floated, waved, then went still. But orders were orders, and the war had no room for ghosts. Those missions changed how men fought. Before, there was still some part of us that thought about the rules, Geneva Conventions, naval codes, rescue rights. But the Pacific didn't care about rules. You either killed or got killed. By then, the Japanese had their own record of mercy lost, pilots strafing lifeboats after sinking Allied ships, submarines machine gunning survivors in the water. We knew it. We remembered it. That knowledge became fuel. When our turn came, few hesitated. It wasn't revenge. It was war's twisted version of balance. Still, the old-timers, the ones who'd been through the early years, they saw what was happening and didn't like it. One night I overheard the skipper and the executive officer arguing in the wardroom. The skipper slammed his hand on the table and said, "If we start killing everything that moves, we're no better than them." The exec just stared at him and said, "Sir, they made that choice long before we did." That was the end of it. Nobody won that argument because nobody could. We kept moving north closer to Japan. Each day brought new missions, new briefings, new numbers to replace the old ones. But no one forgot that convoy. Even the ones who hadn't been there talked about it like they had. Stories spread like salt in the air, carried from ship to ship, distorted but never doubted. They said the sea was still burning 2 days later. Oil slicks stretching past the horizon, crows circling for miles. Some said sharks had come, drawn by the blood, feeding until the water turned black. Others swore they could still see faces in the waves at night, reflected in the searchlights. Sailors are superstitious by nature, and after that mission they had reason to be. One of our radio operators, quiet guy named Harris, told me he picked up a faint SOS the next day. The signal was weak, Japanese code barely readable. Survivors, convoy, burning. Then it cut off. He logged it, but command dismissed it as interference. I saw the look on his face when he told me. He knew what he'd heard. He just wished he hadn't. You'd think something like that would have been kept quiet, buried in reports, never mentioned again. But word travels. It always does. Even the Japanese heard whispers through their own networks. Families waited for letters that never came. Some of those men had sons, fathers, brothers on those ships. They were told the convoy went missing, presumed lost. No one ever told them how. That's another thing war does. It hides the truth because the truth would break too many hearts. When I think of those pilots, I don't see monsters. I see men who ran out of good choices. One of them, Lieutenant Clay, had been in the Coral Sea and Midway. He'd seen ships explode, men burned alive, comrades blown apart by suicide planes. When I met him years later at a veterans' dinner, he said he didn't regret the mission, but he regretted what it made of him. You start to forget they're people, he told me. They're just targets, until you stop firing. Then it hits you. He looked down at his drink for a long time after that. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. You could measure the Pacific campaign in islands taken or miles advanced. But the real measure was in what it did to a man's conscience. Some never recovered. You'd see them sitting alone at night, staring into the dark, hearing things that weren't there. The sound of engines, the pop of machine guns, the cries that came from nowhere. They weren't crazy, they were just haunted. Every man who fought in those waters brought a piece of it home with him, whether he wanted to or not. The Japanese command learned from that loss, but they learned too late. After the convoy, their doctrine shifted. They began spreading supply runs in smaller groups, trying to make detection harder. They painted ships darker, sailed only under cloud cover, sometimes cutting engines entirely to drift past radar sweeps. But it was a losing game. America's reach had grown too long. Submarines prowled like wolves, planes searched like hawks. Every time they tried to feed their army, the ocean took another bite. That one convoy was a warning written in smoke. I remember hearing about one of the pilots who flew that day, an ensign barely 21, who didn't come back. His plane was hit by flak from one of the burning transports. It exploded mid-air, no chute, no trace. Some of the men said it was karma. Others called it bad luck. I call it war evening the scales. No one leaves clean. You can't drop fire from the sky and expect to walk away untouched. When the war ended, none of us talked much about that operation. Officially, it wasn't even listed by name in most after-action reports. It was folded into convoy interdiction activities, a sterile phrase that told nothing and hid everything. The historians later had to dig through fragments to even piece together what happened. The men who were there, on both sides, didn't need the paperwork. They remembered every second. Years later, when the movies started coming out, the ones that made war look noble and glorious, I couldn't sit through them. Not because they were wrong exactly, but because they left too much out. They never showed what happens after the explosion, after the cheering, when the water fills with the aftermath. They didn't show the looks on the pilots' faces when they landed and realized victory doesn't feel like victory when it comes like that. One evening long after the war, I was on a fishing trip off California. The sun was setting, orange and red like it always does over the Pacific. And for a second I caught myself holding my breath. The water shimmered, peaceful and endless. And yet somewhere deep down I still saw that convoy, still saw the smoke, the men in the water, the fire falling from the sky. You can't unsee that kind of thing. It stays with you, quiet but heavy like a weight you've learned to carry without noticing. Sometimes I wonder if those men knew what hit them, if they saw the planes coming and thought it was rescue. I hope not. I hope the end came quick. That's the kindest thing I can think to wish for them. After all these years, I don't ask myself who was right anymore. The war is long over. The nation's rebuilt, the oceans are cleaner, the sky's quieter, but the ghosts are still there. Every time a ship passes through that stretch of water, I swear the waves look different. Darker, heavier, like they remember. Maybe they do. The Pacific doesn't forget, it just waits. After the war ended, it took years for the full story of that convoy to crawl its way into daylight. For a long time, no one wanted to talk about it. The reports were buried under piles of paperwork labeled classified or tactical record only. The men who were there, those who fired and those who watched, carried it quietly. When you came home from the Pacific, you didn't talk about the sea. You talked about victory, about the flag raised over Iwo Jima, about the march into Tokyo Bay, but you didn't talk about the places where the water itself turned black. I think deep down, most of us knew the world wasn't ready for that truth. War heroes were supposed to be clean. We were supposed to be symbols, not reminders of how far men can fall when the sky is full of smoke. The convoy didn't fit the story America wanted to tell. It didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like vengeance. And vengeance doesn't look good on a medal. It was maybe 20 years later, sometime in the early 60s, when I first read a newspaper clipping about it. A historian had found fragments of Japanese records, partial logs, intercepted messages, survivor testimonies from fishermen who'd been near the site. He called it the convoy that vanished. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough. Reading it was like opening an old wound you thought had healed. The dates lined up, the positions matched. That was the one. By then, the pilots were older, quieter. Some were already gone. The ones who remained didn't like seeing it in print. They said it made them out to be killers. I remember one of them, a man I'd known since the war, saying, "People think we had a choice." I didn't answer. Maybe we didn't. Maybe we did. War has a way of erasing the difference. I got a letter once from a Japanese man who said his father had been in that convoy. He'd found my name in an old article. His letter was polite, almost painfully so. He said his father's ship had been hit by torpedoes, but that he'd survived the explosion. He floated on a raft for hours, watching the sky. Then he saw planes. He thought rescue had come. He wrote that his father had told his mother, before he died years later, that the planes fired on them without warning. He said he didn't blame us. He just wanted to understand why. I wrote him back. I told him I didn't know why. I told him what I knew, that by then mercy was a luxury nobody could afford. I told him that his father's face had probably haunted someone on our side too. I never heard back. Maybe that was enough for him. Maybe not. As the years went on, more of the truth came out piece by piece. The Navy declassified some of the records. Historians argued over what really happened. Was it an intentional attack or a tragic misunderstanding? Some said the pilots believed the men in the water were armed. Others said the orders were clear: leave no survivors who could return to the fight. The truth probably sits somewhere in between. I remember visiting the National Archives once, long after I'd retired. They had microfilm records of the mission logs. I sat there, in that cold, sterile room, listening to the hum of the machine as I scrolled through reel after reel of typewritten pages. Most of it was numbers, coordinates, flight times, weather conditions. Then one line stopped me cold. Enemy survivors observed in water. Strafing conducted until fuel low. No further activity reported. No emotion, no hesitation, just facts. I stared at that line for a long time, trying to feel what the man who typed it must have felt. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. There's a certain kind of numbness that comes from doing what you think you have to do. It doesn't go away. It just settles like silt in the bottom of your soul. I think that's why so many of us kept quiet. Talking about it meant stirring it up again, making the water cloudy. So we left it alone. We told the easy stories instead, the ones about courage, not the ones about conscience. The Pacific didn't forgive easily either. I went back there once on a tour in the 80s. It was part of a veterans memorial trip. Old sailors, pilots, Marines. We visited sites all across the islands, from Midway to the Philippines. When we flew over the stretch of ocean where that convoy went down, I looked out the window and felt a strange calm. The water was clear and blue, as if nothing had ever happened there. But I knew better. Beneath that surface lay thousands who never got graves. I thought of the Japanese families who never had bodies to mourn. I thought of the American airmen who carried guilt they never spoke of. It was all still there somewhere under that calm blue. Oh. One night during that trip, we sat on a hotel patio overlooking the sea. A few drinks in, the talk turned to old times. That's how it always went, slow, cautious, then deep. One of the men, a pilot named Burke, said softly, "You know, we never really came home." He didn't mean our bodies, he meant our minds, and he was right. Part of us was still out there, circling over that convoy, trying to decide what kind of men we were. Burke told me something I never forgot. He said that after one of his strafing runs, he pulled back up and saw his reflection in the cockpit glass. "I didn't recognize the man looking back at me," he said. "That's when I knew the war had won." The war always wins in its own way. Nations can sign treaties, soldiers can go home, but the war stays. It lives in the men who fought it, and sometimes it shows up in their son. And you can tell by the way they talk, the way they hesitate when a plane flies overhead, the way they fall silent when someone mentions the sea. Over the decades, that convoy became something of a legend. Some called it the day America crossed a line. Others called it necessary justice. I don't know which it was. Maybe both. History has a habit of dressing up horror in uniforms of righteousness. We all do it. It's easier that way. You can't build monuments for guilt. There was talk once of adding a plaque somewhere to commemorate the lost men of that convoy, Japanese and American alike, but it never happened. Too complicated, they said, too political, maybe too honest. The past, after all, can still make people uncomfortable. But sometimes I think about what that plaque would say if it existed. Maybe just a few words. Here, in this sea, men on both sides discovered what war truly costs. That would be enough. The younger generations don't always understand why old men still talk about it. To them, it's history, just another chapter between D-Day and Hiroshima. But to us, it's not history. It's memory. It's the smell of fuel, the hum of engines, the sight of black smoke against blue sky. It's the weight of knowing that survival doesn't always mean victory. Whenever someone asks me about it now, I tell them what I told that Japanese man. War doesn't ask for your permission. It just takes. It takes your youth, your sleep, your peace, and sometimes your soul. And the worst part is, it makes you think you gave it willingly. Even now, when the ocean breeze hits just right, I can almost hear it. The low drone of planes somewhere in the distance, fading into the hum of time. I tell myself it's just imagination, but deep down I know better. The Pacific still remembers, it always will. It's strange, the way time softens everything except memory. I've forgotten faces, names, and the dates of battles that once meant the world to me. But that convoy never fades. It comes back in flashes. Not nightmares exactly, but moments. I'll be reading a newspaper or watching the ocean from a pier, and suddenly I'm back there again. Hearing engines somewhere in the distance and smelling oil in the air. You never really leave the war, you just learn how to live with its echoes. After the war, they said we fought for peace. Maybe we did. But when you've seen peace built on the backs of the dead, you start to wonder what the word even means. We won, yes. The flags were raised, the bands played, the parades rolled through the streets, but the men who'd fought across the Pacific knew the cost better than anyone. We'd seen what victory looked like up close, and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't the sound of cheers, it was the silence that comes after everything else has stopped. There's a photo I saw once. Black and white, grainy, taken by a war correspondent who flew in one of those planes. It showed the ocean after the smoke cleared, calm as glass, littered with debris. In the distance, you could just make out a few dots. Maybe men, maybe wreckage. The caption read simply, "OMD, end of convoy." I stared at that photo for a long time. Whoever took it must have known he was capturing something more than war. He was capturing the moment humanity stepped outside itself. I think about the Japanese pilots sometimes. Not the ones in the convoy, but the ones who would come after. Maybe some of them had fathers or brothers who died that day. Maybe that's what drove them when they dived their planes into ships months later. I've often wondered if the fire that consumed them started on that sea, when they learned that even mercy could drown. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It just finds new hands to hold the gun. After the war, some of us tried to put it behind us. We found jobs, built families, went to church, laughed at baseball games. On the outside, we looked like any other men. But inside, part of us was still 20 years old, staring down from a cockpit or watching the horizon for smoke. My wife once asked me why I'd wake up some nights with tears in my eyes, and I told her it was just the past catching up. She never asked again. God bless her for that. When the documentaries came years later, all those polished voices narrating our lives as if they were stories, I couldn't sit through them. They always got something wrong. They'd show maps, arrows, grainy film of ships exploding, and then talk about strategic victory. But they never showed the faces. They never told the part that mattered, how it felt to be there, how it broke something inside you that could never be fixed. They made it sound clean, efficient. There was nothing clean about it. The ocean doesn't wash away guilt, it just buries it deep. I've spoken to historians who wanted details. They'd ask, what were the altitudes, the formation, the timing? I'd tell them the truth. I don't remember the numbers, I remember the screams, The smell, the way the water boiled under gunfire, they'd nod, polite but distant, as if I'd given them less than what they came for. But numbers don't tell stories. Men do. I met one Japanese historian once at a veterans event in Honolulu. He bowed, introduced himself, and said quietly, "My grandfather was on one of those ships." We stood there for a moment, neither of us sure what to say. Then he added, "He was lucky. He died before the planes came." I didn't know whether to say I was sorry or not. In the end, I just said, "I hope he found peace." He smiled faintly and said, "I hope we all do." The truth is, nobody wins a war like that. Nations win, flags win, politicians win, but the men who fight it, they just survive. And survival isn't the same as winning. It's waking up every day and carrying the weight of what you've done and what you've seen. It's walking past a child playing by the water and realizing that he'll never know the kind of world you once lived in. And you pray he never will. There's an old saying among sailors, "The sea remembers its dead." I believe that. The Pacific is vast, but it's not empty. Beneath those calm waves lie the stories of millions. American, Japanese, Australian, Filipino. Some went down in fire, others in silence. The ocean holds them all without judgment. It doesn't care who was right or wrong. It just keeps them. I've been back to that part of the ocean once more since the 80s. A memorial cruise, small group of us, most in our 70s and 80s by then. We dropped flowers over the side, chrysanthemums for the Japanese, lilies for the Americans. The wind was gentle, the sea quiet. The petals floated for a moment, then slowly sank. I thought about how, in that same spot decades before, men had fought and died under a burning sky. And now all that remained was peace, not the kind you fight for, the kind time gives you when everything else is done. As we sailed away, one of the younger men asked me if I thought it was right. What we'd done that day. I didn't answer right away. I watched the water behind the ship, the white wake fading into the blue. Finally, I said, "It wasn't right, it wasn't wrong, it was war." He didn't say anything after that. Some things don't need explanations. Now as I sit here and write this all down, my hands shake and my eyesight isn't what it used to be. But I still remember that convoy, the smoke, the soot, the way the ocean glowed red and gold in the firelight, the way the world seemed to hold its breath while men decided what kind of monsters they were willing to become. If you're reading this, maybe you'll shake your head, maybe you'll think it was all madness. You'd be right. But it was our madness, our moment in history when the world lost its innocence and never got it back. We didn't set out to become executioners. We just got lost somewhere between justice and survival. There's a part of me that still prays for those men, not out of guilt, but out of respect. They fought for their country the same way we did. They died believing they were right, same as us. In another life, maybe we would have shared a drink, laughed about the sea, talked about fishing or families. But fate had other plans. Every war leaves behind stories no one wants to tell. This was one of them. And maybe that's why I've finally told it. Not for forgiveness, not for judgment, but for memory. Because if we don't remember, we repeat. And I've lived long enough to know that the ocean doesn't need any more ghosts. When I close my eyes, I can still see it. The endless Pacific, the faint shimmer of sunlight on waves, the sound of engines fading into silence. Somewhere out there, beneath that calm, they're still waiting. The Japanese sailors, the American pilots, the lost, the fallen, the forgotten. The sea keeps their secret, but not forever. The tides whisper it, and if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the words, "Remember us." And I do every day. Every